the guns finally go cold across Europe, leaving behind a silence heavier than the artillery barrages. It is May 1945, and the Third Reich has collapsed into rubble, taking its ideology with it. But in the forests and on the roadsides, the steel skeletons of its most feared predators still wait, watching a world they no longer rule. For nearly 6 years, the continent had been consumed by the violence of mechanized warfare. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen steppes of the Eastern Front, the tank had reigned as the supreme arbiter of the battlefield. Among these machines, one name had generated a specific trembling frequency of fear in the hearts of Allied soldiers: the Tiger. It was a word that became synonymous with invulnerability, a monster of thick steel and high-velocity firepower that seemed to shrug off incoming rounds like rain. But as the surrender documents are signed and the occupation forces fan out across a broken Germany, the Tiger tank reaches the end of its life as a weapon of war. The transition is abrupt and surreal. On Monday, these 60-ton behemoths were priority targets hunted by fighter bombers and heavy artillery. On Tuesday, they are merely abandoned hulks of metal rusting quietly in the spring rain. Allied soldiers, who days earlier would have terrified at the sight of that boxy silhouette, now climb onto the hulls to smoke cigarettes and pose for photographs. The fear evaporates, replaced by a profound curiosity. For the first time, the British, American, and Soviet armies possess the physical reality of the German war machine without the danger of it firing back. A new kind of race begins immediately, not to destroy these tanks, but to locate, catalogue, and understand them before they disappear into the scrap heaps of history. By the time the final capitulation order was given on May 8th, roughly 1,800 Tiger tanks had been manufactured between the original Tiger Perez and the massive Tiger II variants. In the grand calculus of the war, this was a surprisingly small number compared to the tens of thousands of Shermans and T-34s produced by the Allies. Most of the Tigers had already been destroyed in combat, their carcasses left burning in the fields of France, Italy, and Russia. But as the dust settled, intelligence officers realized that a significant number of these machines had survived the final collapse. The state of this surviving fleet was a chaotic mosaic of the war's final desperate weeks. Several hundred Tigers were scattered across the landscape of Central Europe, found in every imaginable condition. Some were discovered sitting pristine in factory depots, their paint still fresh, lacking only fuel and crews to become lethal. Others were found in rail yards chained to flatbed cars that had never left the station due to bombed-out tracks. But a great many were found in a state of self-inflicted ruin. As the German command structure disintegrated, crews were often ordered to scuttle their own vehicles rather than let them fall into enemy hands. In forests and village squares, Allied troops found Tigers with their gun barrels peeled back like bananas, the result of demolition charges set in the breach. Engine blocks were fused into solid lumps of metal by thermite grenades. In some cases, where explosives were unavailable, crews had simply drained the oil and run the massive engines until they seized or poured bags of sugar into the fuel tanks. These were acts of denial, a final spiteful attempt to keep the secrets of German engineering from the victors. Yet the sheer durability of the Tiger meant that even a sabotaged tank offered a wealth of information. A blown barrel did not hide the thickness of the frontal armor. A seized engine did not conceal the complexity of the suspension system. The most significant discoveries were made at the German proving grounds and research facilities, places like Kummersdorf and Hillesleben, and the Henschel factory floors. Here, the steel beasts were found in varying stages of assembly and testing. There were hulls without turrets, turrets without guns, and experimental chassis that had never seen mass production. American and British technical intelligence teams swept through these facilities with lists of specific items to secure. They walked past rows of silent giants, marking them with chalk, some for transport, some for study, and some for immediate scrapping. The atmosphere in these depots was eerie. The factories, which had been the beating heart of the German armaments industry, were now silent cathedrals of industry. Unfinished tanks sat on assembly lines that had stopped moving mid-shift. Tools were left on workbenches as if the mechanics had just stepped out for a break. For the Allied engineers, walking through these halls was like walking into the belly of the beast they had been fighting for years. They could finally see the craftsmanship that went into each vehicle, the high-quality welding, the complex interlocking armor plates, and the over-engineered transmission systems. However, a crucial strategic question emerged almost immediately. What should be done with them? For the intelligence branches, every surviving Tiger was a textbook waiting to be read. They wanted to ship them back to Aberdeen in Maryland, to Bovington in England, and to Kubinka in Russia for rigorous testing. They wanted to know why the Tiger's gun was so accurate and why its armor was so resilient. But for the occupation authorities responsible for disarming Germany, these tanks represented a latent threat. Even a disabled Tiger was a symbol of the military power that had just devastated Europe. There was a genuine fear in the early months of the occupation that resistance groups or werewolf units might try to reactivate abandoned armor. A Tiger tank, even one with a limited fuel supply, could wreak havoc on a local occupation garrison equipped only with jeeps and light trucks. Therefore, the directive from the Allied Control Commission was clear and unforgiving. The German war machine was to be dismantled. This created a tension between the desire to learn from the enemy's technology and the political necessity to obliterate it. As the summer of 1945 approached, the few remaining Tigers sat at this crossroads. They were heavy, immobile, and politically toxic. The soldiers who guarded them looked at the thick steel plating and wondered how anything had ever penetrated it. The locals looked at them as reminders of a failed regime and a devastating defeat, and the engineers looked at them as puzzles to be solved. The decision of which tanks would be saved for the laboratories and which would be cut apart by torches was often made by a junior officer standing in a muddy field, deciding whether a specific tank was worth the immense trouble of moving it. This selection process was the first filter in the Tiger's post-war history. Of the hundreds that existed in May, only a fraction would be selected for the journey to the victors' homelands. The rest were destined to become scrap metal, to rebuild the very cities they had once defended. The silence of the depots was about to be broken by the sound of heavy recovery engines, and as the selection teams marked their choices with white chalk on the dusty armor plates, the immediate reality of their prize began to sink in. Identifying a Tiger tank as a war trophy was the easy part. Moving it was a logistical nightmare that bordered on the impossible. In the shattered infrastructure of 1945 Europe, where bridges were blown, rail lines were twisted ribbons of steel, and roads were cratered moonscapes, the Tiger's greatest strength, its massive armor, became its most debilitating liability. The Tiger weighed nearly 60 tons combat-loaded. The King Tiger, or Tiger II, tipped the scales at 70 tons. These were not vehicles designed for transport, they were mobile bunkers designed to hold ground. For the recovery crews charged with dragging these behemoths back to the Channel ports, the task required engineering solutions that simply did not exist in standard manuals. Ordinary heavy-duty trucks, the workhorses of the Allied logistics chain, groaned and snapped axles under the strain. Standard tank transporters designed to carry 30-ton Shermans were crushed by the sheer density of the German heavy metal. To move a single King Tiger required a coordinated effort that resembled a major construction project more than a vehicle recovery. Bridges had to be reinforced or bypassed entirely. Specialized railway flat cars, reinforced with extra steel beams, had to be located in a rail system that had been systematically dismantled by Allied bombing campaigns. The irony was not lost on the Allied engineers. To move the pride of the German army, they often had to rely on the Germans themselves. In depots where Tigers were found in semi-operative condition, captured German mechanics were ordered to revive the massive Maybach engines. Under the watchful eyes of American MPs, these former enemies worked to coax the 700-horsepower beasts back to life, merely to drive them onto the flatbeds that would carry them away forever. The thirst of these engines was staggering. Starting a cold Tiger and moving it a few miles to a railhead consumed gallons of precious fuel, a resource that was in critically short supply across the occupied zone. Many Tigers that had been earmarked for preservation were abandoned simply because the fuel required to move them was deemed better spent on heating homes or powering transport trucks for food relief. For the lucky few tanks that survived the journey to the ports of Antwerp or Cherbourg, they were hoisted by massive dockside cranes onto Liberty ships bound for the United States. Their destination was the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, the premier testing facility of the U.S. Army Ordnance Corps. Here, far from the mud and fear of the European theatre, the steel beasts would face their final and most rigorous battle. They would not be fighting against other tanks, but against the slide rules, hardness testers, and high-velocity cameras of American science. The atmosphere at Aberdeen was clinical. The tanks were stripped of their combat clutter, cleaned of the grime of war, and subjected to a scrutiny that was entirely devoid of emotion. The US Army wanted answers to the questions that had haunted their tankers from Tunisia to the Rhine. They wanted to know with mathematical certainty exactly what it took to kill a Tiger. The firing tests conducted on these captured hulls remain some of the most comprehensive metallurgical experiments in military history. American gunners lined up standard 75mm guns, the main armament of the M4 Sherman for much of the war, and fired at the Tiger's frontal armor from various ranges. The results were a sobering validation of the fear Allied crews had felt in combat. Round after round of 75mm armor-piercing ammunition slammed into the thick, flat plate of the Tiger Wanis and the sloped glacis of the King Tiger, and round after round shattered or ricocheted harmlessly into the sky. At combat ranges of 1,000 yards, the Tiger was effectively invulnerable to the standard American tank gun. Even at point-blank range, the 75mm shells left only gouges in the face-hardened steel, a terrifying physical proof of the technological disparity that had existed in 1943 and 1944. The tests then escalated to the 76mm high-velocity guns and the heavy 90mm gun of the M26 Pershing. Here, the invincibility of the Tiger began to crack. The engineers documented that while the Tiger I was still a formidable opponent, its vertical armor layout was an antiquated design compared to the sloped protection of newer vehicles. The 90mm gun, firing improved ammunition, could punch through the Tiger's front plate at standard engagement ranges. The King Tiger, however, remained a stubborn puzzle. Its frontal armor was so thick and so well sloped that even the best Allied guns struggled to achieve a clean penetration reliability. The tests concluded that while the Tiger was not invincible, it forced the Allies to bring their absolute heaviest weaponry to bear to ensure a kill. But the autopsy at Aberdeen went deeper than just shooting at steel plates. American automotive engineers dismantled the Tigers bolt by bolt to understand the machine's heart. They pulled the Maybach engines and placed them on dynamometers to measure horsepower and torque curves. They disassembled the complex transmission systems and the famous interleaved road wheels. What they found was a paradox of engineering philosophy. The craftsmanship was undeniably superb. The machining of the gears and the quality of the optical sights were of a standard that American mass production rarely bothered to achieve. The steering system, which allowed the heavy tank to turn largely by using a steering wheel rather than crude brake levers, was a marvel of hydraulic sophistication. However, the American verdict was also deeply critical. The engineers noted that this perfection came at a terrible price. The suspension system, with its overlapping wheels, was a maintenance nightmare, trapping mud and ice that could freeze the tank solid overnight. The transmission was overstressed by the immense weight of the vehicle, prone to failure if the driver was not an expert. The engine compartment was cramped, making field repairs difficult and time-consuming. The final report from Aberdeen painted a picture of a weapon that was individually superior, but strategically flawed. The Tiger was a gladiator designed to win one-on-one duels with overwhelming strength. But the American philosophy of war was based on reliability, ease of manufacture, and strategic mobility, areas where the Tiger failed miserably. The US Ordnance Corps concluded that while they respected the Tiger's lethality, they did not envy its design. They had proven that their new guns could kill it, and they had proven that their own tanks, while less heavily armored, were superior machines for fighting a global mobile war. The Tiger was a terrifying adversary, but in the cold light of the Maryland testing grounds, it was revealed to be a dinosaur, magnificent, powerful, and evolutionary, dead-ended. While the Americans were blasting steel plates in Maryland to determine penetration values, the British were conducting a very different kind of investigation in the quiet, oily workshops of Bovington and the School of Tank Technology. The British approach to the Tiger was less of a firing squad and more of a forensic autopsy. Having faced the Tiger longer than any other Western ally, first encountering it in the dusty hills of Tunisia in 1943, the British had already developed the weapon to kill it, the 17-pounder anti-tank gun. They knew they could destroy it. Now they wanted to understand the mind of the engineers who had built it. In the hangars of Dorset, British mechanics and engineers stripped the captured Tigers down to their absolute bare components. This was not a general inspection, it was a granular disassembly. They removed the turret, lifted the massive Maybach HL230 engine, and pulled apart the complex gearbox, laying every gear, cog, and washer on white canvas sheets. They treated the 60-ton war machine like an oversized Swiss watch, analyzing the metallurgy of the transmission and the tolerances of the steering system. The reports they generated were a mix of profound professional admiration and bewildered frustration. The British engineers were forced to admit that in terms of pure mechanical function, the Tiger was a masterpiece. They marveled at the steering system, which utilized a sophisticated hydraulic regeneration capability that allowed the driver to steer the heavy vehicle with the light touch of a steering wheel rather than the muscle-straining brake levers found in Allied tanks. They looked through the Zeiss optics, the telescopic sights that gave German gunners their legendary long-range accuracy, and found glass of a clarity and precision that British industry could not match. The ride quality, smoothed by torsion bars, and the complex wheel arrangement was remarkably stable, allowing for accurate fire on the move. However, as they delved deeper into the suspension system, the British uncovered the fatal flaw of the German design philosophy. They stared at the Schachtelaufwerk, the famous interleaved road wheel system where multiple wheels overlapped each other like stacked dinner plates. On a drafting table, it was a brilliant way to distribute the tank's immense weight, but in the mud of the real world, it was a mechanic's nightmare. The British testers noted that the gap between the wheels was a perfect trap for mud and slush. If a Tiger parked for the night in freezing temperatures, that mud would freeze into a solid block of concrete hard ice, immobilizing the tank completely. Worse, if an inner wheel was damaged by a mine or debris, the crew had to remove up to 9 outer wheels just to reach the broken one, a task that could take hours in the freezing cold, often while under fire. One British engineer, summarizing the findings, famously captured the paradox of the Tiger. He wrote that the tank did not lose the war because it was weak. It lost because Germany could not support it. The maintenance requirement was simply too high. For every hour the Tiger spent in combat, it required hours of skilled labor to keep running. It was a weapon built for a war of short, decisive victories, not a grinding war of attrition where spare parts were scarce and fuel was non-existent. Thousands of miles to the east, the Soviet Union was conducting its own evaluation, but with a philosophy that stood in stark contrast to the clinical disassembly in Britain. No nation had suffered more at the hands of the Tiger than the Soviet Union. At the Battle of Kursk alone, over 100 Tigers had spearheaded the German assault, chewing through Soviet defenses. Now, with the war over, the Red Army possessed dozens of intact specimens at their testing grounds in Kubinka, and their testing regimen was ruthless, destructive, and vengeful. The Soviet engineers were not interested in the finesse of the steering gears or the clarity of the glass. They were interested in destruction. They lined up their own heavy tanks, the IS-2 and the experimental IS-3, and fired their massive 190mm and 100mm guns at the captured Tigers until the German tanks were reduced to scrap. They wanted to see exactly how much punishment the German steel could take before it failed. The results of these tests were terrifyingly violent. The Soviet 122mm shell was a massive projectile carrying profound kinetic energy. The tests at Kubinka revealed that even when the shell did not penetrate the Tiger's thick armor, the sheer force of the impact caused spelling. This meant that the shockwave traveled through the steel and caused the metal on the inside of the tank to flake off in razor-sharp shards, turning the interior of the turret into a blender of flying steel. A Tiger crew could be killed without a single hole appearing in their tank's exterior. The Soviet designers took these lessons and applied them directly to their future designs. They looked at the Tiger's vertical armor and rejected it, doubling down on the sloped armor concept of the T-34. They looked at the Tiger's complex, high-maintenance engine and rejected it, choosing instead rough, loose-tolerance diesel engines that could run on low-quality fuel and be fixed with a sledgehammer. The Tiger taught the Soviets exactly what not to build. It reinforced their belief that a tank should be a simple, brutal sledgehammer, not a precision instrument. Stalin himself took a personal interest in the fate of the Tigers. He ordered several of the captured cats to be restored to running condition, not for scientific study, but for propaganda. In the years following the war, Soviet film studios used these running Tigers in war movies, depicting them being crushed by valiant Soviet tankers. It was a final humiliation for the machine that had once terrified the steppes, reduced to a movie prop, driven by the victors, and destroyed on cue for the cameras. By late 1946, the verdict from both East and West was clear. The British had proven the Tiger was a logistical failure, a fragile genius that could not survive the rigors of a long war. The Soviets had proven that it was mortal, a beast that could be cracked open by a big enough hammer. The mystique of the Tiger had been dismantled, piece by piece, and shot by shot. The Allies now understood that the monster of 1943 was, by 1946, an evolutionary dead end. But even as they wrote their reports, a new rumor was circulating in the intelligence community, a whisper about a final, even more dangerous variant that the Germans had tried to build, a tank that made the original Tiger look tame. As the testing grounds in the east and west echoed with the sound of gunfire against the hulls of the original Tiger one-shot, intelligence officers were already turning their attention to a far more elusive and dangerous prize. The Tiger Y, for all its fame, was a design conceived in 1942, a boxy relic of the mid-war years. But rumors, reconnaissance photos, and terrifying battlefield reports spoke of a successor, a machine that represented the absolute zenith of German heavy armor engineering. This was the Panzerkampfwagen Tiger Ausfuhr B, known to the Germans as the Königstiger, and to the Allies simply as the King Tiger. If the Tiger I was a brawler, the King Tiger was a fortress. Weighing nearly 75 tons, it discarded the vertical, flat armor of its predecessor in favor of thick, aggressively sloped plating that mimicked the Panther and the Soviet T-34. Its frontal armor was 7 inches of hardened steel, sloped back at a sharp angle to provide an effective thickness that was virtually impenetrable to any Allied tank gun in existence. Its main weapon, the long-barreled 89mm KWK-43, was a rifle of such immense power that it could destroy a Sherman or a Cromwell from distances where the Allied tank was invisible to the naked eye. The hunt for these machines led Allied technical teams into the heart of the shattered German industrial complex, specifically to the Henschel and Son factories in Kassel. What they found in the bombed-out ruins of the assembly halls was a chilling glimpse of what the Third Reich had intended for the future of warfare. Sitting on the production lines, frozen in time by the surrender, were rows of unfinished King Tiger hulls. Nearby lay prototype turrets with even heavier armor protection and blueprints for vehicles that had never left the drawing board, monstrous tank destroyers and the theoretical E-series tanks that were designed to standardize German production. The discovery of the King Tiger infrastructure had a profound influence on the post-war thinking of both NATO and the nascent Warsaw Pact. The British, staring at the sheer size and gun power of the King Tiger, realized that their own tank designs were woefully undergunned, a realization that accelerated the development of the Centurion tank and its eventual Royal Ordnance cannon. The Soviets, seeing the heavy sloped armor, pushed forward with their IS-3 and T-54 programs, obsessed with creating tanks that could deflect the kind of firepower the King Tiger possessed. The ghost of this German Leviathan essentially dictated the design parameters of the Cold War main battle tanks that would face each other for the next 40 years. But while the steel and the guns captured the imagination of the engineers, the most valuable intelligence secured by the Allies did not come from the factory floor. It came from the filing cabinets of the abandoned battalion headquarters. In the chaos of the retreat, German clerks had left behind the maintenance logs, unit, diaries and supply requisitions of the heavy tank battalions. These documents, written in the dry, bureaucratic language of logistics, revealed the secret weapon that had actually defeated the Tiger fleet, its own fragility. As Allied analysts translated these daily reports, a picture emerged that was vastly different from the propaganda of the invincible Tiger. The logs detailed a nightmare of mechanical attrition. They showed that for every hour a King Tiger spent in combat, it required 10 to 15 hours of intensive maintenance. The strain on the transmission and the final drives, the gears that transfer power to the tracks, was catastrophic. The 75-ton weight of the vehicle simply exceeded the material limits of the steel available to Germany in the late war. The gears stripped, the seals burst, and the engines overheated with depressing regularity. The records painted a portrait of battalions that were defeated not by enemy fire, but by their own logistics. One report might show a unit starting the day with 45 tanks. By noon, 10 have dropped out due to transmission failure. By evening, another 5 are abandoned because they ran out of fuel. By the time the unit actually makes contact with the enemy, only a handful of machines are operational. The Allies read accounts of terrified crews blowing up their own factory-fresh King Tigers because a single 50-cent gasket had failed and there was no recovery vehicle capable of towing the monster to safety. The fuel consumption figures were equally shocking. The King Tiger devoured gallons of gasoline just to start its engine and idle. In a Germany that was being strangled by strategic bombing, this thirst was a death sentence. The logs showed commanders making impossible choices, siphoning fuel from 3 tanks to fill up 1, leaving the others to be scuttled. The strategic mobility of the heavy tank battalions was an illusion. They were essentially static pillboxes that could move only short distances before breaking down or running dry. This archival evidence fundamentally changed the Allied understanding of the war they had just won. During the fighting, the Allied soldier saw the Tiger as a dragon, a terrifying, unstoppable force. But the maintenance records revealed that the Dragon was sick, starving, and lame. The Tiger had not been overwhelmed solely by the masses of Sherman tanks or the human waves of the Soviet Union, as German generals liked to claim in their memoirs. It had been defeated by the laws of physics and logistics. Germany had built a weapon that was too heavy for the bridges, too thirsty for the supply lines, and too complex for the field mechanics. The revelation was a decisive moment in military history. It codified the lesson that amateurs talk strategy, professionals talk logistics. The King Tiger was the ultimate tactical weapon, nearly unkillable from the front and capable of killing anything it saw, but it was a strategic failure. It could win a duel, but it could not win a campaign. The Allies realized that their own approach, building reliable, transportable tanks with standardized parts, had been the correct one all along. The King Tiger was a magnificent piece of engineering art, but as a tool of war, the maintenance logs proved it was a disaster. As the analysts closed the files and the engineers finished their measurements, the awe that surrounded the King Tiger began to fade, replaced by a cold, pragmatic judgment. The Royal Tiger was not a king, it was a cautionary tale in steel. And with the testing complete and the lessons learned, the Allies were left with one final question. What to do with the hundreds of tons of Nazi armor now cluttering the depots of Europe? The answer would come in the form of the cutting torch. The final death of the Tiger tank does not happen in the heat of battle, but in the cold silence of a scrapyard. By the winter of 1946, the firing ranges at Aberdeen and Kubinka fall silent as the technical intelligence teams pack away their calipers and notebooks. The scientific value of these machines has been exhausted, and now they are merely heavy, toxic ghosts that must be erased from the earth. With the testing phases concluded, the status of the captured fleet shifts instantly from intelligence asset to hazardous material. The Allied Control Commission, the governing body responsible for the administration of occupied Germany, issues a directive that is absolute in its intent: the total demilitarization of the German nation. This order does not distinguish between a functioning weapon and a museum piece. Every piece of armored rolling stock bearing the Balkenkreuz is to be reduced to its constituent elements. The fear of a resurgence of German militarism is still palpable in the capitals of Europe, and the sight of a Tiger tank, even a rusted one, is a psychological scar that the occupation authorities are eager to cauterize. The destruction that follows is industrialized, methodical, and total. In the designated scrapping zones established across the British, American, and Soviet sectors, the remaining Tigers are lined up for execution. But destroying a 60-ton machine built to survive anti-tank fire is not a simple task. Standard oxy-acetylene torches struggle to cut through the face-hardened steel of the frontal armor. The metal is so dense and chemically treated that it resists the flame, forcing demolition crews to work for days on a single hull. To expedite the process, the Allies turn to the surplus explosives that litter the continent. Engineers pack the interiors of the Tigers with captured German munitions, seal the hatches, and detonate them. The resulting explosions are the final sounds of the Tigers' war. Across the training grounds of Bavaria and the forests of Saxony, the heavy thud of demolition charges echoes daily. The massive turrets, weighing nearly 10 tons on their own, are blown skyward, flipping through the air before crashing into the mud, their ring gears shattered. The hulls are split open like clamshells, exposing the rusted interiors to the rain. The structural integrity is broken. The cutting teams move in to slice the carcass into manageable slabs of scrap metal. There is a desperate economic driver behind this carnage. Europe is a continent in ruins, its cities flattened and its infrastructure severed. The rebuilding of France, Germany, Poland, and the Soviet Union requires steel, millions of tons of it. The Tiger tanks, along with thousands of Panthers and Panzerwaffes, represent a massive, accessible reservoir of high-quality metallurgy. The very steel that was forged to destroy European cities is now harvested to rebuild them. A Tiger tank that once terrorized the roads of Normandy is melted down and reborn as a steel girder for a new bridge in Cologne, or rebar for a housing block in Rotterdam. The sword is literally beaten into a plowshare, not out of pacifism, but out of necessity. Beyond the need for steel, there is a pressing environmental imperative to clear the wrecks. In the chaotic final months of the war, tanks were abandoned in rivers, driven into swamps, or left in the middle of fertile farmland. As the seals on their engines and transmissions rot, these machines begin to bleed. Hundreds of gallons of gasoline, synthetic oil, hydraulic fluid, and battery acid leak into the soil and the water table. Farmers petition the military government to remove the iron corpses from their fields so they can plant crops. The tiger, once the apex predator, is now viewed simply as a toxic nuisance, a leaking obstacle that stands in the way of the harvest. The recovery efforts to clear these stragglers are immense. Heavy recovery vehicles, often American M26 Dragon wagons or British Scamels, are deployed to drag the rusted hulks out of the ditches. In the Soviet zone, the Red Army uses brute force, often employing teams of T-34 to pull stubborn tigers out of the marshes. There is no ceremony in this work. The tanks are dragged to railheads, loaded onto flat cars and shipped to the blast furnaces of the Ruhr Valley. The scale of the purge is difficult to comprehend. Thousands of armored vehicles are processed in a span of less than 30 months. Some tigers meet a more violent end as live-fire targets. In the early years of the Cold War, as NATO and the Warsaw Pact begin to form, new generations of tank crews need hard targets to practice their gunnery. The hulls of surviving tigers are dragged out to the firing ranges of Grafenwöhr and Bergen-Hohne. There they are pounded by the new guns of the Centurion, the M47 Patton, and the T-54. They are shot at until they are little more than Swiss cheese, their armor perforated by thousands of rounds, slowly disintegrating under the impact of the weapons designed to replace them. By 1948, the landscape has been effectively scrubbed clean. A traveler driving across Germany would struggle to find a single trace of the armored legions that had defended the Reich just 3 years earlier. The depots that had held hundreds of captured vehicles are empty. The factories that built them have been dismantled or converted to produce tractors and pots. The Tiger tank has effectively ceased to exist as a physical object. From a production run of nearly 1,800 vehicles, the number of intact survivors drops to single digits. The statistical probability of a tiger surviving this period is less than 1%. This systematic erasure creates a strange historical void. For the generation that fought the war, the tiger was a vivid, terrifying reality. But for the generation born immediately after, the tank becomes almost mythical, a monster that exists only in grainy newsreels and the stories of grandfathers. The physical evidence of its existence has been melted down and poured into the foundations of the new Europe. The systematic destruction was so thorough that by the time military museums began to realize the historical value of these machines in the 1950s and 60s, it was already too late. The herds of steel beasts were gone, leaving behind only a few lonely survivors to carry the weight of their legacy. Out of the fires of the scrapping drives and the detritus of the post-war cleanup, a handful of machines miraculously slip through the net. By the time the dust settles in the 1950s, the global population of Tiger tanks has been reduced from nearly 2,000 to a number that can be counted on 2 hands. These few survivors owe their existence not to their combat prowess, but often to bureaucratic accidents, mechanical failures that left them stranded in obscure locations, or the foresight of a few museum curators who saw value in the steel carcasses. The most famous of these survivors resides in the quiet hills of Dorset, England. Tiger 131, captured by the British Army in Tunisia in 1943, was spared the cutting torch because it was the first intact Tiger ever taken by the Western Allies. For decades, it sat as a static display at the Tank Museum in Bovington, a silent curiosity for visitors. But in the 1990s, the museum embarked on an ambitious and seemingly impossible project to bring the beast back to life. The restoration of Tiger 131 became a forensic archaeology project. Engineers had to manufacture parts that had not been produced since the bombing of the Henschel factories. They sourced components from the bottom of rivers and the back of dusty depots. When the massive Maybach engine finally coughed to life after years of silence, it was the only Tiger tank in the world capable of moving under its own power. Across the Channel in France, the Musée des Blindés in Saumur shelters a King Tiger that survived the desperate fighting of the Colmar Pocket. In Belgium, in the small village of L'Aglaise, another King Tiger sits as a permanent monument. This tank, abandoned by Kampfgruppe Peiper during the Battle of the Bulge, was left behind simply because it ran out of fuel and was too heavy to tow. For years, the villagers debated scrapping it, one local even trading a bottle of cognac for the rights to salvage scrap metal from it, before it was ultimately preserved as a stark reminder of the winter of 1944. In Russia, the Kubinka Tank Museum holds the battered hulls that survived the ruthless Soviet testing, their armor scarred by the impacts of the 122mm shells that proved their mortality. As the decades passed and the raw memories of the war began to fade, the perception of these tanks shifted. In the 1970s and 80s, a new generation of historians and collectors began to view the Tiger not as a weapon of a hated regime, but as a masterpiece of mechanical engineering and a rare historical artifact. This shift sparked a modern gold rush for heavy armor. Rumors began to circulate in the collecting community of Tigers swallowed by the swamps of the Eastern Front, of tanks driven into marshes by retreating crews to hide them from the Red Army. Recovery teams, armed with ground-penetrating radar and heavy excavation equipment, began to scour the forests of Latvia, Poland, and Russia. These expeditions are dangerous and difficult, pulling a 60-ton tank out of a peat bog where it has rested for 70 years requires engineering skills comparable to moving a building. When these bog giants finally break the surface, the mud often preserves them in a time capsule state. The paint is still visible on the steel, the leather seats are intact, and inside the crew compartments, the personal effects of the young men who fought in them, combs, photos, unfinished rations, are found just as they were left in 1945. However, the restoration of these recoveries poses a unique ethical and technical challenge. A Tiger tank is built from thousands of precise, interlocking parts. Finding a replacement for a specific transmission gear or a road wheel hub is impossible in the modern market. Restorers often have to cannibalize 3 or 4 incomplete wrecks to build one complete vehicle, creating Frankenstein tanks that are composites of different machines. The cost of a full restoration can run into the millions of dollars, funded by private collectors and national museums who understand that these machines are now the Mona Lisas of the military world. A single track link, a rusted piece of iron that was once scrap, now commands thousands of dollars at auction. Today, fewer than 10 complete Tiger Whiz tanks and a similar number of King Tigers exist worldwide. Their rarity has transformed them. They are no longer viewed as the terrifying monsters that haunt the nightmares of infantrymen. They are viewed with a mix of awe and somber reflection. When Tiger 131 runs at the Bovington Tank Fest, thousands of people gather in silence to hear the sound of the engine. It is a visceral connection to the past, a sensory bridge to the history books. The ground shakes, the exhaust smells of unrefined gasoline, and for a brief moment, the terrifying reality of 1944 becomes tangible. The legacy of the Tiger is, therefore, a complex paradox. It remains the most recognized tank in history, a symbol of German technical prowess and the terrifying aesthetic of the Wehrmacht. It represents a zenith of industrial engineering, a machine built with the precision of a watch, but the scale of a locomotive. Yet the surviving maintenance logs and the autopsies conducted in 1945 remind us of the other side of the coin. They remind us that the Tiger was also a failure, a logistical disaster that consumed its own tail, a weapon that was too complex, too heavy, and too expensive for the reality of total war. The handful of survivors that rest in museums today stand as silent witnesses to this duality. They teach us that engineering brilliance is meaningless without the logistical spine to support it. They stand as monuments to a regime that prioritized the wonder weapon over the practicalities of production and supply. The Tiger tank, once the hunter that prowled the steppes and the hedgerows, is now a captive of history, trapped behind velvet ropes, safe to touch, but still radiating the heavy, dark gravity of the violent era that forged it. There is a profound stillness that surrounds a heavy tank when the engine is cut and the museum lights are dimmed. Standing before a Tiger tank today, it is difficult to reconcile the cold, quiet metal with the havoc it was designed to unleash. We look at the welding seams and the thickness of the steel, and we marvel at the ingenuity required to build it. But we must also remember the purpose of that ingenuity. These machines are not just sculptures of steel, they are tombs and tools of a devastating ideology. The young men who crewed them and the young men who fought against them were caught in a grinding clash of industries that treated human life as just another consumable resource, alongside fuel and ammunition. The survival of these few tanks allows us to confront that history not as an abstract concept in a book, but as a physical reality that towers over us. The story of the Tiger's post-war journey from the scrap heaps of 1945 to the climate-controlled halls of 2024 is a testament to our desire to remember. We save these monsters not to glorify them, but to ensure that the lessons they teach are not melted down and forgotten. They remind us that even the most invincible technology is ultimately fragile, and that the mightiest war machines eventually become nothing more than rust and echoes without the context we provide them. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the wreckage and restoration of history. If this story offered you a new perspective on the past, we would be honored to have you with us for the next chapter. Until then, stay curious and take good care.